By the time the HOA president, Marlene, lodged her fraudulent lien against my 3,200-acre ranch, the FBI was already deep into an investigation of her $2.3 million mineral rights theft, complete with documented evidence and her recorded confession. Her assumption was that she was swindling an uneducated farmer. In reality, this farmer had been meticulously constructing a federal case. Imagine the scene. You are mending a fence on property your great-grandfather settled 60 years ago. A morning haze drifts over the fields where 3 generations of your family have raised livestock. You can take in the scent of fresh hay, listen to your Angus cattle lowing in the background, and feel the gravel crunch beneath boots that have trod this path countless times. Then, you check your mail and discover a certified letter that alters your entire world. A notice of property sale informs you that your 3,200 acres were just auctioned off due to $847 in delinquent HOA dues. This is precisely the situation Jake Riverside found himself in, and his subsequent actions not only dismantled a single corrupt homeowners association but also sent tremors throughout the whole system. How would you react if strangers lawfully sold off your family's heritage while you were at your job? Leave a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, because this tale demonstrates that sometimes the unassuming individuals fight back with the greatest force. At 52, Jake Riverside was a third-generation cattleman whose rough hands spoke volumes of his life of hard labor. His great-grandfather had claimed this land as a homestead back in 1960, a time when a piece of the American dream could still be secured with sweat, equity, and sheer will. The undulating landscape extended to the horizon, divided by a creek that was always full and sprinkled with black Angus cattle that recognized Jake's voice from a quarter of a mile off. Following his divorce 2 years ago, Jake divided his time between the ranch and his position as a diesel mechanic in town. The mechanic job covered the expenses while the cattle business gradually recovered. His 2 teenage children, Emma and Tyler, devoted their weekends to helping with fence mending and feeding. It was not a glamorous life, but it was their own. Then, Marlene Whitfield became a new resident in the area. Marlene, 58, had moved from California 5 years prior with her tech executive spouse and an attitude so potent it could have powered her smart home. She had purchased a home in Meadowbrook Estates, a new development of 47 upscale houses erected on what was once the Johnson family's wheat farm. In just 6 months, she had become the HOA president. Within a year, she was making life difficult for everyone. "Those cows are an eyesore," Marlene declared on her first visit to Jake's front porch. Her high-end heels tapped on the aged wood with the rhythm of a ticking clock. Her perfume assailed Jake like a noxious gas, clashing harshly with the wholesome sense of hay and farm animals. Property values in our community rely on upholding specific standards. Jake clutched the leather-bound property deed inherited from his grandfather, its familiar heft of comfort in his work-worn hands. "Ma'am, respectfully, your community stops at that fence. This has been cattle country since before your time." But Marlene was not paying attention. She was already scheming. The campaign of harassment began subtly. His mailbox was toppled on 2 separate occasions in a single month. His cattle gate was discovered open, allowing 30 head of Angus to meander onto the county road. Unsigned complaints inundated the county offices regarding unsightly agricultural practices and alleged health risks. Next, the property assessor arrived, appearing perplexed as he surveyed Jake's property with a GPS device. "Sir, I regret to inform you, but our records indicate that sections of your land have been reclassified." "Reclassified as what?" "Part of the Meadowbrook Estates' HOA jurisdiction. It says here it was changed in 2019 due to, let's see, abandoned agricultural status." Jake almost spit out his evening coffee. The acrid flavor mirrored his mood as he stayed awake until 2:00 a.m. Poring over legal papers by lamplight, abandoned. He had been raising cattle on this land without interruption for 15 years. He had settled every tax bill, repaired every fence, and submitted every agricultural exemption form. Yet somehow, impossibly, his 3,200 acres were now registered with the county as belonging to Marlene's HOA domain. No notice had ever been delivered. No public hearing had ever been convened. One day the land was his. The next, it was part of a suburban community that didn't even exist when his great-grandfather first tilled the soil. The smell of diesel and the morning air couldn't cover up the foul odor of corruption at the county courthouse. And Marlene, she was only getting started. You are given 30 days to adhere to architectural standards, her subsequent certified letter stated, or you will incur daily fines of $50. Your barn is a non-conforming building and must be taken down or altered to align with community regulations. Jake stood on the very ground where his great-grandfather had first laid eyes on their piece of paradise, observing the sun descend over the land that had sustained 3 generations of his family. The cattle were getting comfortable for the evening, their soft noises blending with the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass. He was not yet aware of it, but he was on the verge of uncovering something that would alter the entire situation. This had nothing to do with property values or community aesthetics. It was about wealth, a substantial amount of it, and Marlene Whitfield was prepared to seize a man's whole legacy to obtain it. Marlene was not satisfied with merely threatening Jake's barn. She was just warming up. The harassment intensified more rapidly than a wildfire in a dry season. The first move was a cease and desist letter, bearing the HOA's official stamp and served by a process server who seemed ashamed to be there. The document called for the prompt demolition of all non-compliant agricultural buildings, which included Jake's barn, his tool shed, and, incredibly, even his grandfather's original water well. "Ma'am," the process server had uttered, fidgeting on Jake's porch. "I've delivered many documents, but this one strikes me as odd." The aroma of newly mown grass from the HOA's meticulously kept common grounds wafted over the property line like a hostile force. Jake could hear the ceaseless drone of their commercial mowers tending to grass so flawless it appeared artificial. Nothing exemplifies community like a $500 penalty for an incorrectly colored mailbox. Jake mused darkly, but Marlene had contacts. Her husband, Bradford Whitfield, a tech executive, had connections in high places. In less than a week, the county inspector appeared without warning, clipboard at the ready and a scowl that indicated this was not his first dubious inspection. "Sir, our records show this land has been designated as part of the Meadowbrook Estate subdivision since 2019. Inspector Morrison stated, peering at his tablet with the look of someone who had seen this act before. Jake felt his blood pressure climb. "That's not possible. I've been paying property taxes on this land for 15 years. Morrison rotated his tablet to show Jake the screen. There it was in digital print. His 3,200 acres were listed as being under HOA control, classified as residential agricultural rather than purely agricultural. The modification was dated April 15, 2019. Jake recalled that day he was supposedly deployed with the National Guard for tornado relief efforts, except he hadn't been. He had been on the job at Morrison's Diesel every single day that month. With the time cards to back it up, a mechanic friend had taught Jake something years ago. When administrative corrections are made to county databases, they don't necessitate owner notification if the land seems deserted. A clerk downtown could effectively steal your property with a few clicks, and you wouldn't find out until it was too late. "This is fraudulent," Jake declared softly, yet his voice resonated with the gravity of 3 generations of honest labor. Morrison just shrugged, but Jake noticed something in his expression. Guilt? Apprehension? "I only enforce what's recorded in the system. Sir, you'll have to address this with the county clerk's office." Jake's response was rapid and systematic. If 15 years of mechanical work had taught him one thing, it was that every issue has a resolution if you tackle it in an organized way. He engaged Kowalski Land Surveying, the same company his grandfather had hired in the 1960s. The son of old Pete Kowalski now managed the firm, and he recalled the original survey markers. "Your great-grandfather set those markers securely, Jake. Let's check if they're still there." They were, and as Pete Jr. used his advanced GPS technology to trace the initial property lines, a remarkable fact came to light. The HOA's prized common area, that immaculately groomed lawn between the development and the county road, was actually located 50 feet within Jake's property. "Well, I'll be," Pete Jr. said under his breath, double-checking his measurements. "Based on the original federal homestead grant, the HOA constructed their main entrance on your property." But this is where Jake's clever move emerged. Rather than confronting Marlene directly, he chose a more intelligent path. He investigated her past and learned she had been dismissed from an HR position in California due to a discrimination lawsuit. More crucially, he discovered that Inspector Morrison was a resident of Meadowbrook Estates, living just 2 doors down from Marlene. Jake's reaction was perfectly orchestrated. He lodged a counter-complaint regarding the HOA's unapproved storm drainage system and then erected "No Trespassing" private property signs directly across their manicured entryway. When Marlene's Lexus screeched to a halt in his driveway, he was prepared. "You can't place those signs there," she yelled, her voice ascending like a squeaky gate hinge. Jake was propped against his truck, a manila folder in his hand. "According to the original survey, ma'am, your community's entrance has been on my land for 5 years, but that's not the most interesting part." He opened the folder, displaying Morrison's work history and home address. "The interesting part is the way county inspectors who reside in your HOA consistently find issues with properties you're looking to take over." Marlene's face turned pale. She had not anticipated Jake making that connection. That night, Jake contacted his ex-wife, Patricia. Being a paralegal, she had dealt with enough property conflicts to recognize the pattern instantly. "Jake, this isn't just random pestering. This is methodical title fraud. Someone has been orchestrating this for a considerable time." Outside, his cattle were settling down for the evening, but Jake was only beginning. The ticking sound of his old truck's cooling engine mingled with the faint hum of the HOA's security lighting. Everything seemed calm. But Jake now realized he was up against something far greater than minor neighborhood squabbles. Tomorrow, he intended to find out just how far this conspiracy extended. Marlene did not react well to being cornered. Like many bullies, she intensified her actions when her bluff was challenged. Within 48 hours of Jake's property line discovery, the HOA board, consisting of 5 members all chosen by Marlene, convened an emergency session to deal with the ongoing violations at 47250 County Road 18. That was Jake's address, and he was not invited to speak in his own defense. The meeting's minutes, which Jake acquired via a public records request, seemed like a targeted attack plan: a daily fine of $50 for non-compliant agricultural buildings, an additional $50 for not adhering to approved landscaping regulations. Incredibly, his cattle were now classified as unauthorized livestock, subject to daily fines until they were gone. The total was shocking: $12,000 in backdated fees going back to 2019, on top of accumulating daily fines. Jake's ex-wife, Patricia, ever astute, identified the actual scheme right away. "They aren't trying to get money, Jake. They're creating a debt large enough to serve as grounds for foreclosure." The scent of legal documents and rising panic permeated Jake's kitchen as he laid out papers on his grandfather's old oak table. Every receipt, every tax statement, every agricultural permit for the last 15 years. If it was a paper war they desired, he was ready to provide one. But Marlene hadn't finished using her influence. Her subsequent action was truly malicious. She persuaded the county to reclassify Jake's cattle as nuisance animals that needed special permits. Suddenly, the livestock that had grazed on this land for generations were deemed illegal. Jake's response was to retain Sarah Bennett, the most formidable real estate lawyer within a 100-mile radius. Sarah had been raised on a farm before attending law school, meaning she was well-versed in both agriculture and legal battles. Her initial step was masterful. She asked for a comprehensive title history tracing back to the original homestead grant. "Jake," Sarah stated, her voice taut with restrained fury as she examined the papers, "someone has been extremely active in the county clerk's office. Your property wasn't merely added to the HOA's records by mistake. It was deliberately targeted." The conclusive evidence was in plain view. The administrative change that had moved Jake's land was authorized by Deputy County Clerk Rebecca Torres. Sarah's investigation showed that Torres resided at 1247 Meadowbrook Lane, just 3 doors down from Marlene. The change had been made on April 15, 2019, the very day Torres got back from a trip to Cabo San Lucas, a trip that, based on her social media activity, she had taken with Marlene Whitfield. Jake recalled a piece of advice from his grandfather: "When you're fixing an engine, trace the connections. Everything is connected to something else." The same idea held true for corruption. You just needed to know where to search. But this is where Jake's mechanical thinking paid off. He began to document everything with the systematic precision of someone who had spent years troubleshooting intricate machinery. Every conversation was recorded, which was legal in his state. Every encounter was photographed. Every piece of correspondence was filed with a timestamp. His major breakthrough came from an unexpected place: Betty Morrison, an 83-year-old widow whose land bordered Jake's eastern fence line. Betty had been waging her own fight with the HOA over her late husband's workshop, which Marlene asserted was in violation of building codes despite being grandfathered in for 30 years. They pulled the same trick with Pete Kowalski's horse pasture. Betty shared with Jake over coffee at Murphy's Diner, her aged hands firm despite her years. The same method, the same clerk, the same inexplicable changes in the county records. The taste of Murphy's overbrewed coffee couldn't hide the harsh truth. This was not a random campaign of harassment. It was a calculated operation aimed at rural properties neighboring Meadowbrook Estates. Jake had unwittingly uncovered something that made his own troubles seem minor. Sarah's title investigation revealed the full extent of the scheme. 3 other properties, amounting to nearly 800 acres, had been administratively altered to fall under HOA jurisdiction between 2019 and 2021. All these changes occurred while the owners were temporarily absent or preoccupied with personal matters, and all were signed off by Rebecca Torres. All were properties that would be valuable for future development or held strategic importance for the subdivision's growth. The crucial twist that altered the entire situation came when Sarah learned that the HOA's financial statements were public record. As Jake sifted through the spreadsheets late one evening, the sound of his old printer groaning as it churned out page after page of evidence, a single entry stood out: legal consulting fees. $847,000 over 3 years, $847,000 in legal expenses for a 47-home subdivision. That amounted to almost $18,000 per household annually, enough to purchase a respectable new truck. But the most incriminating detail was the payee: Whitfield and Associates Legal Services, a firm owned by Bradford Whitfield's brother-in-law. Jake leaned back in his chair, the distant sounds of his cattle settling for the evening in the background, and he smiled for the first time in weeks. Marlene hadn't just been stealing land. She had been siphoning HOA money to relatives while concocting legal disputes to legitimize the expenses. Tomorrow, he would begin to piece all the evidence together, and by the time he was done, Marlene would regret ever having heard the name Jake Riverside. Marlene's subsequent action showed she was becoming desperate. People in dire straits make foolish errors, and Marlene was on the verge of making a significant one. Bradford Whitfield's tech industry contacts were not just for appearances. Within a few days of Sarah's financial findings, Jake was visited by the state fire marshal, the EPA, and somehow even the IRS. All of these visits were prompted by anonymous reports of environmental infractions, improper chemical storage, and undeclared agricultural earnings. The fire marshal discovered nothing amiss. Jake's diesel tank was properly licensed and inspected each year. The EPA found that Jake's cattle operation was actually enhancing water quality through rotational grazing, a fact they reluctantly confirmed after testing the water in his creek. However, the IRS audit was intended to be a form of punishment. Irrespective of the findings, even law-abiding taxpayers could be financially devastated by a prolonged federal inquiry. Jake's ex-wife, Patricia, observed him sorting through boxes of receipts on his kitchen table, the air thick with the scent of old paper and stress. This isn't a coincidence, Jake. Someone with significant influence is systematically trying to ruin you. But Jake had been approaching the problem like a mechanic again, and mechanics understand that when several systems break down at once, you search for a shared root cause. He hired a private investigator, a former state trooper named Buck Hawkins, who specialized in white-collar crime. Buck's investigation unearthed the beautiful, yet terrible, reality. Bradford Whitfield's tech firm, Horizon Data Solutions, had recently formed a partnership with Chesapeake Energy Development to offer geographic data analysis for the acquisition of mineral rights. In simpler terms, they were using satellite imagery and geological studies to pinpoint valuable land for energy resource extraction. Jake's ranch was not merely situated on land. It was located above one of the county's largest natural gas reserves, valued at an estimated $2.3 million over a decade in extraction rights. The geological study had been finalized 18 months prior. The systematic harassment of Jake had commenced 6 months after that. They weren't attempting to take your land, Buck clarified, his gruff voice heavy with the experience of 30 years in law enforcement. They were trying to seize your mineral rights, acquire the property through an HOA foreclosure, and then lease the gas rights to Chesapeake. The twist that sealed Marlene's doom came from an unlikely place: her own hubris. During a contentious HOA board meeting, secretly recorded by Jake's new ally, Betty Morrison, Marlene completely lost her composure. "We have poured too much time and money into this endeavor to allow some backwoods farmer to sabotage everything." Her voice came through clearly on the recording. "Bradford's contacts at Chesapeake are anticipating the transfer of those mineral rights by December, and we cannot tolerate any further setbacks. Betty Morrison, with all the righteous anger of her 83 years, had succeeded in recording the entire 40-minute session on her grandson's phone. Marlene had just admitted to conspiracy, mineral rights fraud, and used words that showed her true motives were not about property values. They were about sheer greed. But Jake's true breakthrough occurred when Sarah found something that completely altered the legal dynamics. Jake's great-grandfather's original homestead grant contained federal anti-speculation clauses that were still legally enforceable. Any effort to unlawfully acquire homestead property for commercial purposes was a violation not only of state law but also of federal law. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice tight with excitement, as she laid out the original 1960s papers on his kitchen table. "This is no longer just fraud. This is a federal matter. The FBI takes homestead violations very seriously." The taste of genuine hope mingled with his morning coffee as Jake perused his great-grandfather's deed. The old man had been shrewder than anyone knew, making sure the land would remain in the family and be safe from exploitation by speculators. 3 generations later, those safeguards were about to rescue the ranch. Jake's counteroffensive was swift and crushing. Sarah initiated a quiet title action to completely clear his property deed, erasing any hint of HOA control. She also filed a lawsuit against the HOA for fraudulent lien and attempted theft. But the decisive blow was her formal complaint to the FBI's white-collar crime unit regarding systematic homestead fraud. Meanwhile, Jake was growing his alliance. Pete Kowalski's horse ranch had been a target. Betty Morrison's workshop was under threat. 3 other rural landowners realized their properties had been inexplicably absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction without their consent. They formed what Jake privately dubbed the Grudge Squad. 7 property owners with a total of 3,000 acres and enough legal might to bring Meadowbrook Estates to its knees. The community's reaction was swift and powerful. Murphy's Diner began offering Justice coffee. With the profits donated to Jake's legal defense, the hardware store displayed a sign that read, "We support rural property rights." Even the local bank president, whose family had been farming in the area for 4 generations, publicly endorsed Jake's cause. But the most significant pressure came from an unexpected quarter. The local newspaper, editor Tom Bradley, whose own grandfather had lost his farm to eminent domain abuse in the 1980s, transformed Jake's story into a cause célèbre. "Rural Landowners Resist Corporate Land Grab" became a front-page series that was syndicated by agricultural journals across the state. Marlene was about to learn that stealing from farmers in a farming community was like prodding a beehive, and Jake was just getting started. The phone call that changed the course of events came on a Tuesday morning as Jake was welding a broken gate hinge. Sarah's voice, filled with barely suppressed excitement, crackled over the line. "Jake, you should sit down for this. My title search just went back to the original federal land grant, and what I discovered is going to astound you." Jake put down his welding torch, the sharp smell of hot metal blending with the morning dew as he walked to his truck. "What kind of astound me? The mineral rights kind, your great-grandfather's homestead grant doesn't just cover the surface. It includes everything beneath it: oil, gas, coal, you name it, and Jake. There's a geological survey from 18 months ago indicating massive natural gas deposits under your land." The world seemed to shift on its axis as Jake absorbed this new information. His great-grandfather, a man who had never owned anything more luxurious than a Ford pickup, had unknowingly secured mineral rights valued at millions. How much are we talking about? A conservative estimate is $2-3 million over 10 years if the gas rights are leased correctly. But here's the real kicker. Someone else was already aware of this. Sarah's investigation had exposed the true plot. Horizon Data Solutions, Bradford Whitfield's tech firm, had been hired by Chesapeake Energy to locate properties with valuable mineral reserves using satellite geological analysis. Jake's ranch had been identified as a top priority acquisition in a report from 15 months ago. The systematic harassment was not just random, petty despotism. It was industrial espionage followed by an attempt at large-scale theft. "They weren't trying to steal my farm," Jake said slowly, the realization dawning on him like a cold shock. "They were trying to steal my great-grandfather's legacy and use it to fund their retirement." But the news got even worse. Buck Hawkins's inquiry showed that Chesapeake Energy had already drafted initial extraction plans for Jake's property. These plans detailed access roads, drilling locations, and pipeline routes, all based on the assumption that ownership would be transferred to the Meadowbrook Estates Development Corporation by January 2025. Marlene wasn't just playing petty HOA politics. She was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar robbery under the guise of suburban property management. The emotional weight of it all hit Jake like a physical force. For months, he believed he was battling minor officials over building regulations and property boundaries. In reality, he had been protecting his family's entire future from corporate predators who viewed his great-grandfather's hard work as nothing more than a financial opportunity. Sarah's voice grew softer as she revealed the last part of the puzzle. Jake, there's more. The federal anti-speculation clauses in your original homestead grant are not just for protection. They're also punitive. Anyone who attempts to fraudulently acquire homestead land for commercial purposes is subject to federal prosecution and treble damages. Treble damages. This meant Marlene and her co-conspirators could be liable to Jake for 3 times the amount they had attempted to steal. 3 times $2.3 million equated to nearly $7 million in potential compensation. Jake sat in his truck, listening to his cattle moving through the pasture that his great-grandfather had cleared by hand 60 years earlier. The old man likely never dreamed that the seemingly worthless rocks beneath his farmland would one day be more valuable than the farm itself. Yet, somehow, with the foresight of a man who had endured the Great Depression, he had safeguarded it all. Sarah, Jake said quietly, I want every single one of these criminals prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law, not for the money, but for every farmer who has lost their land to schemes like this. The taste of righteous indignation was more potent than coffee. Marlene thought she was preying on some ignorant country fellow who wouldn't fight back. Instead, she had challenged 3 generations of American resilience, supported by federal law and mineral rights valuable enough to purchase half the county. Jake's great-grandfather had often said that the land would provide for the family if the family cared for the land. 60 years on, the old man was still honoring his word. Now, it was time to make Marlene pay for underestimating both of them. Sarah Bennett's law office transformed into a command center, and Jake discovered that legal combat demanded the same systematic strategy as overhauling a diesel engine. But instead of components and equipment, they were gathering evidence and supporters. First, we'll completely clear your title, Sarah outlined, arranging documents on her conference table like a general mapping out a campaign. A quiet title action will eliminate any doubt about your ownership. Second, we'll sue the HOA for fraudulent lien and attempted theft. Third, we'll press federal charges for homestead fraud. But Sarah's true brilliance lay in her ability to rally reinforcements. She brought in Maria Santos, a civil rights lawyer specializing in housing discrimination. Maria examined Marlene's recorded statements about maintaining community standards and unsuitable residents, and immediately identified a pattern of targeting rural landowners based on their class and way of life. This is more than just property fraud, Maria declared, her voice filled with the passion of someone who had spent her career fighting corporate bullies. This is systematic discrimination disguised as community enhancement. Jake's task was to document the damages with the detail of a mechanic's log, every legal expense, every missed day of work, every repair necessitated by sabotage. The total was shocking: $43,000 in direct expenses, plus lost farm income and property upgrades he couldn't make while embroiled in legal disputes. But the most potent weapon was Buck Hawkins's financial forensics. The retired state trooper had a knack for tracing money, and the HOA's financial records revealed a story of corruption that would make a seasoned politician cringe. They've been systematically plundering this HOA for 3 years, Buck stated, his weathered hands indicating spreadsheet lines that amounted to grand larceny, legal payments to Bradford's brother-in-law, consulting agreements with shell companies owned by Marlene's family, maintenance contracts at 3 times the normal rate to firms that are barely legitimate. The most incriminating find was a series of emails Buck had acquired through his law enforcement connections. Marlene and Bradford had been plotting the mineral rights takeover for over 2 years, meticulously selecting which properties to go after and how to create legal pretexts for foreclosure. Meanwhile, Jake was assembling his own coalition of rural defiance. Pete Kowalski contributed his horse ranch issues to the cause. Betty Morrison provided her secret recordings of HOA meetings. 3 other targeted landowners joined the lawsuit as co-plaintiffs, transforming individual cases of harassment into a class-action conspiracy lawsuit. The community's backing was immense. Jake's former boss at Morrison's Diesel initiated a legal defense fund that collected $12,000 in 2 weeks, The local Farmers Association unanimously agreed to supply expert witnesses on agricultural methods. Even the Methodist Church, which Jake's family had attended for 3 generations, offered its fellowship hall for strategy sessions. Sarah managed everything with military-like efficiency. She filed the quiet title action on a Monday, the fraud lawsuit on Wednesday, and the federal complaint on Friday. By the next Monday, Marlene was under legal assault on 4 separate fronts at once. Jake's personal preparations were just as organized. He took a temporary leave from his mechanic job to concentrate fully on the legal fight. His children, Emma and Tyler, returned to the ranch to live full-time and assist with the cattle. Even his ex-wife, Patricia, despite their complex past, offered paralegal help during evening strategy meetings. The psychological tactics were Sarah's idea. Instead of avoiding the media, they actively sought it out. Tom Bradley's newspaper series had attracted the attention of agricultural journals statewide. Sarah set up interviews that portrayed Jake as a symbol of rural property rights facing a corporate onslaught. Every time Marlene sees your face in the news, Sarah clarified, she's reminded that this won't be resolved quietly. Corporate bullies rely on their victims remaining silent and isolated. But Jake's favorite part of the preparations was the security enhancements. Buck Hawkins assisted him in setting up a surveillance system that would impress the FBI. Every part of Jake's property was now under the watch of cameras that streamed footage directly to the cloud. If Marlene decided to resort to sabotage, she would be providing them with video evidence for a federal case. The aroma of fresh coffee and resolve filled Sarah's conference room during their final planning meeting. The walls were covered with maps displaying property lines, mineral surveys, and HOA zones. Boxes of evidence were piled high. Phone logs, financial records, and email printouts formed a paper trail leading straight to Marlene's conspiracy. Jake, Sarah said, going over their timeline one last time. In 60 days, we're going to argue this case before a federal judge. Everything needs to be flawless. Jake leaned back, thinking of his great-grandfather who had cleared this land with nothing but willpower and his own 2 hands. The old man had weathered the Great Depression, droughts, and economic downturns. Marlene Whitfield was merely another challenge to be conquered. Sarah, Jake stated, his voice filled with 3 generations of unyielding determination. We're not just going to argue this case, we're going to dismantle them so thoroughly that no HOA will ever attempt this kind of scheme again. The anticipation of justice was intoxicating, and Jake was eager to deliver it. Cornered creatures are dangerous, and Marlene Whitfield was about to demonstrate just how ferocious a suburban predator could be when her $1-million plot began to unravel. The sabotage started subtly. Jake's cattle water troughs, which had supplied fresh drinking water for decades, were suddenly tainted with motor oil. 30 head of black Angus cattle stood by the polluted water sources, bewildered and parched, as Jake scrambled to clean the systems and bring in emergency water. But Jake had learned from his grandfather's tales of range disputes in the past. Desperate individuals resort to desperate measures, and such actions leave a trail. Each contaminated trough was documented with photographs. Every gallon of spoiled water was recorded, and every veterinarian bill for the cattle's health was meticulously filed. The fence cutting was next. Jake awoke to discover his eastern boundary fence had been cut in 3 different spots, allowing his entire herd to wander onto County Road 18 at 5 in the morning. The sound of semi-trucks braking hard to avoid his cattle was the kind of alarm that could age a person a decade in 10 seconds. Buck Hawkins's security cameras captured it all. At 2:17 a.m., a figure dressed in dark attire had systematically snipped the fence wire with bolt cutters. The person moved with a clear plan, knowing precisely where to cut to cause the most disruption, and was cautious to stay out of the view of the main surveillance cameras. It was almost as if someone had extensively studied the ranch's layout. Jake spent 6 hours rounding up his cattle with the help of neighboring ranchers, the smell of diesel fumes and road dust mingling with his mounting rage. But his mechanical mind was already at work. The saboteur had steered clear of the obvious camera locations, but had overlooked the wildlife cameras Jake used to watch the creek crossings. When Buck examined the wildlife camera footage, they struck gold. Bradford Whitfield's Mercedes, with its license plate in plain sight, was parked on the county road at 2:15 a.m. Bradford himself, a tech executive moonlighting as a midnight fence cutter, was seen climbing into Jake's pasture with wire cutters and a flashlight. Amateur, Buck grumbled, observing the sharp, clear video of Bradford's criminal act. 20 years in corporate meetings made him forget that crime takes a certain level of skill. But Marlene was far from done. Anonymous reports flooded the IRS about Jake's undeclared agricultural earnings. Environmental complaints alleged he was unlawfully discharging chemicals into the creek. Fire safety violation claims cited improper propane storage. Every complaint necessitated official inquiries, legal rebuttals, and time that Jake could ill afford. The crucial insight came when Jake noticed the pattern of complaints perfectly mirrored Marlene's corporate HR background. She was systematically lodging every kind of regulatory complaint she had learned to use during her career in California, attempting to bury Jake under a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. Jake's response was elegantly straightforward. Instead of addressing each complaint one by one, he documented the overall pattern. Sarah filed a federal harassment lawsuit, presenting evidence of 23 distinct false complaints submitted within a 6-week period, all linked back to Marlene through IP addresses and filing records. However, Marlene's desperation soared to new levels when she tried a direct bribe. County Inspector Morrison discovered an envelope with $5,000 in cash placed under his truck's windshield, accompanied by a note implying that Jake's barn might conveniently fail its inspection if Morrison was in need of some vacation funds. Morrison, already anxious about his involvement in the scheme, immediately went to the sheriff. The money was photographed, checked for fingerprints, and traced to a cash withdrawal from Marlene's personal bank account. A handwriting analysis confirmed what was already suspected. Marlene had just committed a felony while she was already the subject of a federal investigation. Jake's 17-year-old son, Tyler, turned out to be surprisingly adept at the electronic side of the battle. Having grown up with smartphones, he was instinctively wary about digital security. When Tyler observed that their home internet was unusually sluggish, he found that someone was monitoring their wireless network from a van parked on county land. "Dad," Tyler said, pointing to his laptop screen which showed a network traffic analysis. "Someone's been reading our emails for the past 3 weeks. Buck's investigation determined that the van was registered to a private detective agency employed by Horizon Data Solutions. Bradford had hired professional surveillance to monitor Jake's legal plans, trying to stay a step ahead of the federal inquiry. But there was something Bradford hadn't taken into account. Federal agents do not take kindly to private individuals meddling in active criminal investigations. When Sarah notified the FBI of the electronic monitoring, Bradford's tech company became the focus of its own federal probe for obstruction of justice. The community's reaction to the escalating sabotage was swift and powerful. Local ranchers began to patrol Jake's property in rotating shifts. Murphy's Diner started denying service to anyone connected with Meadowbrook Estates. The owner of the hardware store put up a sign that read, "HOA board members not welcome." Jake stood in his kitchen, the crackle of police radios in the background as deputies investigated the most recent incident. The acrid taste of contaminated coffee served as a reminder that Marlene was prepared to poison his livestock to get her hands on his land. But every crime she committed was another piece of evidence sealing her legal fate. "Tyler," Jake said, watching his sons skillfully fortify their computer network, "your great-great-grandfather could never have imagined his land would be defended with digital forensics." Tyler smiled. "Different battle, same kind of foe, Dad. People who believe they can just take what isn't theirs." Outside, Jake's cattle were settling down for the night, now safeguarded by cameras, neighbors, and the full weight of federal law enforcement. Marlene had escalated her way directly into a federal prison cell. When direct sabotage proved ineffective, Marlene resorted to psychological tactics with the cruelty of someone who had spent a career dismantling people in corporate HR. The character smearing started with fabricated social media accounts spreading claims about Jake's supposed dangerous instability and violent past. Anonymous posts alleged he had physically threatened Marlene, that his divorce was the result of domestic violence, and that his cattle business was a cover for illicit operations. Each falsehood was carefully designed to seem believable to those who didn't know Jake personally. But Marlene had misjudged the loyalty of a small town. Within hours of the first fake post, Jake's ex-wife, Patricia, posted a public response on Facebook that completely debunked Marlene's lies. "I have known Jake Riverside for 22 years, was married to him for 15, and our divorce had nothing to do with his character," Patricia wrote. "He is one of the most honorable, diligent men I have ever met. Anyone spreading falsehoods about him is either misinformed or malicious, and I lean towards the latter." The post received 300 likes and 47 shares on the first day. Jake's customers from the diesel shop, his cattle buyers, and 3 generations of neighbors came forward with testimonials that depicted him as exactly who he was. A decent man protecting his family's heritage from corporate predators. Sarah recorded every fake account, every false statement, every instance of digital defamation. Cyberstalking and harassment came with severe consequences, especially when they were part of an ongoing federal inquiry. Marlene was constructing her own prison sentence, one lie at a time, but the most perilous escalation occurred when Marlene started to target Jake's children. Anonymous reports to Child Protective Services alleged that Emma and Tyler were living in hazardous conditions on the ranch. The complaints cited insufficient supervision, access to dangerous farm machinery, and exposure to an unstable father. The CPS investigation was meticulous and intrusive. Social workers interviewed the children at school, inspected every structure on the ranch, and questioned neighbors about Jake's parenting skills. The atmosphere in Jake's kitchen was thick with fear and the chill of bureaucratic overreach as he fielded endless inquiries about his children's welfare. Emma, now 18 and filled with a fierce protective instinct, recorded her CPS interview with permission. "My father is the most responsible person I know," she informed the social worker. "Anyone who says otherwise has never witnessed him work 18-hour days to provide for us and keep our cattle healthy." The CPS case was closed within 2 weeks. But the harm had been done. Jake had been compelled to hire a family law attorney, take time off work for interviews, and explain to his children why strangers were questioning their safety. The emotional strain was precisely what Marlene had intended. Jake's countermove was a masterstroke. Instead of shrinking from the smear campaign, he chose complete transparency. Tom Bradley's newspaper published a feature article on a day in the life of Jake Riverside, featuring photographs of him tending to his cattle, fixing machinery, and assisting his kids with their schoolwork. The most impactful part of the article was when Tyler, 17 and wise beyond his years, addressed the camera directly. "People are spreading lies about my dad because he won't. Let them take our family's land. That should tell you everything you need to know about who is in the right and who is in the wrong." But Marlene's final, desperate act showed the true extent of the corruption. She made Jake a settlement offer of $50,000 to drop all legal actions and discreetly sign over the mineral rights to the Meadowbrook Estates Development Corporation. The offer was delivered through an intermediary, a lawyer Jake had never met, who claimed to represent concerned community members wishing to avoid a lengthy legal battle. $50,000 for mineral rights valued at $50,000 for $3 million in mineral rights. Jake stated to the cameras, his voice resonating with 3 generations of unwavering pride, "That isn't a settlement. That is the final confirmation that they intended to rob me blind from the very beginning." The twist that sealed Marlene's fate came from her own desperation. In a recorded phone call to the intermediary lawyer, a call that Buck Hawkins had foreseen and lawfully recorded, Marlene completely lost her composure. "Just threaten him with bankruptcy." Her voice was sharp and clear. "Threaten his children's college education. Threaten everything he has. Bradford's contacts at Chesapeake are becoming restless, and we must have those mineral rights transferred before the federal investigation progresses any further." Bradford Whitfield finally grasped the true cost of his wife's actions. Within 24 hours, he initiated divorce proceedings and retained his own legal counsel. Horizon Data Solutions released a public statement disassociating the company from any HOA-related matters. Even Marlene's own board members started to step down to evade criminal charges. Jake stood in his pasture that evening, watching his cattle graze peacefully as the sun set. A sight his great-grandfather had witnessed thousands of times. The taste of victory was sweet. But the battle was not yet over. The next day, the entire county would be witness to Marlene's final public disgrace. The county commissioners' meeting on October 15th was about more than just property rights. It was about justice, and a significant portion of the county turned out to see it unfold. The courthouse steps were crowded by 7:00 a.m. 2 hours ahead of the meeting's start, farmers in their best work shirts stood alongside suburban families, all brought together by the common belief that stealing land is wrong, no matter who is doing it. 3 local television crews set up their equipment there, reporters interviewing anyone willing to speak about the HOA controversy that had shaken rural America. Jake showed up early with Sarah, both of them carrying boxes of evidence that were the result of months of careful preparation. The air in the courthouse lobby was thick with the scent of coffee and anticipation as well-wishers offered him their support. Betty Morrison, 83 years old and as tenacious as they come, patted his arm with hands that had worked this soil longer than Marlene had been on this earth. "Your great-grandfather would be so proud, son," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had weathered the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and innumerable bureaucratic skirmishes. Marlene showed up 15 minutes late, dressed in a pricey suit and accompanied by a lawyer who looked like he billed by the minute. Her usual air of confidence was beginning to fray, with dark shadows under her eyes and hands that shook slightly as she arranged her documents. The telltale signs of someone who knew the end was near. The commissioner's chamber was filled to capacity. County Commissioner Williams, whose own family had farmed in the region for 4 generations, brought the meeting to order with an uncharacteristic level of formality. "We are here to examine allegations of improper property registry modifications and the potential misuse of HOA authority over agricultural land." Sarah's presentation was methodical and utterly damning. She began with the timeline, detailing how Jake's property had been inexplicably added to the HOA's registry in 2019 without his knowledge. She presented the fraudulent reason given. Claims that Jake was not present when he had evidence he had worked every single day of that month. She uncovered the financial incentive. $2.3 million in mineral rights that Chesapeake Energy was poised to obtain through an HOA foreclosure. This was not a case of minor neighborhood disputes. Sarah declared to the crowded room, her voice reaching the back rows where farmers stood with their arms folded. This was industrial-scale theft, masquerading as community enhancement. A wave of angry murmurs swept through the audience as Sarah presented Bradford's surveillance logs, the images of the contaminated water troughs, the cut fences, and the bribery attempt. Every crime was meticulously documented with photographs, police reports, and timestamps that painted a clear picture of a systematic criminal enterprise. But the moment that shattered Marlene's composure was when Sarah played the audio recording of Marlene's conversation with the intermediary lawyer, her own voice, crisp and undeniable, admitting to the entire plot to steal Jake's mineral rights for Chesapeake Energy. "Just threaten him with bankruptcy, threaten his children's college funds. We need those mineral rights transferred before the federal investigation gets any deeper." The silence in the room was absolute. 200 people had just heard Marlene confess to extortion, conspiracy, and the attempted theft of a family's entire heritage. Several commissioners looked visibly ill. The expensive lawyer seated next to Marlene was furiously taking notes, likely figuring out how to quickly distance himself from the case. Marlene attempted to salvage what was left of her situation. She rose, her voice escalating to the familiar high-pitched tone that had plagued the neighborhood for months. "This is a witch hunt. Jake Riverside is an unsuitable property owner who fails to uphold community standards. His farming activities are not compatible with residential living." The racist undertones were clear. Jake symbolized everything Marlene loathed about rural existence. Honest labor, generational roots, and freedom from corporate influence. Her facade had finally crumbled, exposing the entitled prejudice beneath. That was when a federal agent, Rebecca Torres, emerged from the back of the room. Not the county clerk Rebecca Torres. This was FBI Special Agent Torres, who had been on the case for 3 weeks. "Mrs. Marlene Whitfield," Agent Torres announced, her badge prominently displayed as she approached the defendant's table. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft of federal homestead property, and violation of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." The courtroom burst into chaos. The flashes of cameras illuminated the room as handcuffs were secured around Marlene's wrists. Her high-priced lawyer was already retreating, clearly wanting no part in defending a federal RICO suspect. The crowd's cheers were so loud they seemed to shake the old courthouse windows. But it was Jake's statement that made the moment truly memorable, standing at the podium with the quiet dignity of 3 generations. He looked straight at the cameras. "This was never about me versus the HOA," he stated, his voice firm and unwavering. "This was about defending every American's right to own property without the threat of corporate theft. My great-grandfather established this homestead with nothing but grit and hard work. Today, those same principles triumphed over greed and corruption." The standing ovation that followed lasted a full 3 minutes. Commissioner Williams tried to restore order, but even he was seen wiping away a tear. Outside, car horns blared in celebration. Inside, Marlene was escorted away in handcuffs, with cameras documenting every demeaning step. Justice had been delivered with the full might of federal law, witnessed by all who mattered, and preserved for the historical record. 6 months later, Jake stood on the same hill where this tale began. But the landscape of his life had changed for the better. The legal outcome was both swift and thorough. Marlene pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy charges, resulting in an 18-month sentence in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Bradford's divorce was settled, costing him half of his wealth to cover restitution. The corrupt county clerk, Rebecca Torres, was dismissed from her position and faced her own criminal proceedings for falsifying public documents. Crucially, the county adopted the Riverside Protocol, a new set of regulations that mandated certified mail notifications to all property owners prior to any registry alterations, along with a compulsory 30-day window for appeals. Sarah Bennett was named to the county's newly formed Property Rights Review Board, guaranteeing that no other family would have to endure what Jake had been through. The financial settlement surpassed all predictions. The HOA was compelled to pay Jake $347,000 in damages, legal costs, and punitive damages. Chesapeake Energy, chagrined by the public scandal, presented Jake with a legitimate mineral rights lease valued at $2.8 million over 15 years. More than the original fraudulent plot would have yielded for the conspirators, but Jake's most significant victory was how he used that money. He founded the Homestead Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit offering free legal aid to rural landowners dealing with corporate harassment. The foundation's inaugural case assisted a Nebraska farmer in successfully defending against an energy company attempting to seize his water rights through an abuse of eminent domain. Every rural family is entitled to what my great-grandfather provided for me, Jake declared to the foundation's board, which convened in the very courthouse where Marlene had been taken into custody. The right to own land free from the fear of it being stolen by those with more powerful lawyers. The personal recovery was equally vital. Jake's relationship with his ex-wife, Patricia, had significantly improved as they navigated the struggle together. She had witnessed his best qualities under immense strain as he defended not just his property, but his principles. Their children, Emma and Tyler, developed a newfound admiration for their father's quiet resilience and their family's deep-seated heritage. Jake scaled back his mechanic work to part-time, concentrating on growing the cattle business with the income from his mineral rights. The ranch now sustained 50 head of premium Black Angus, with intentions for organic certification and direct-to-consumer sales. Emma, now a college student majoring in agricultural law, had plans to join Sarah's law firm upon graduation. The wider effects of the case reached the state capitol. Senator Patricia Hawkins, whose own family had lost land to corporate exploitation, introduced the Rural Property Protection Act. The legislation mandated notifications to landowners before any registry modifications, established appeal procedures for contested HOA jurisdiction, and set forth harsh penalties for fraudulent land acquisition schemes. Jake testified before the state legislature, sharing his experience with lawmakers who recognized that rural votes were tied to rural property rights. The bill was passed with unanimous support, with Marlene's mugshot prominently featured during legislative debates on corporate land theft. But Jake's favorite result was the annual Freedom Ranch Days Festival, held each October on his property. What began as a celebration of his legal triumph had evolved into a community event honoring rural traditions and property rights. Local families brought picnics, children got to learn about cattle ranching, and live music filled the very fields that Marlene had attempted to seize. This year's festival attracted over 800 attendees. Tom Bradley's newspaper reported on it as a festival of justice served. Local politicians delivered speeches on the importance of safeguarding family farms. Sarah Bennett was recognized as the Rural Attorney of the Year by the State Bar Association. The conservation easement Jake set up permanently protected 500 acres, ensuring that his great-grandfather's land would never be carved up into strip malls or suburban housing tracts. The dedication plaque for the easement simply stated, "Preserved for future generations by the Riverside family, American farmers since 1960." Standing on his hill as the sun set, Jake could see cattle grazing where Marlene had planned for gas wells, children playing where she had envisioned commercial properties, and families celebrating where she had plotted a corporate heist. The sweet scent of victory mingled with the authentic smells of the farm: hay, cattle, and the rich soil his great-grandfather had entrusted him to preserve. His phone vibrated with a message from a farmer in Oregon dealing with a similar HOA issue. Sarah's practice was now expanding nationwide, taking on agricultural rights cases from one coast to the other. The foundation had successfully funded 12 defenses against corporate land grabs across 6 states. Jake smiled, reflecting on his great-grandfather's assurance that the land would provide for the family if the family took care of the land. 60 years later, that promise was still being kept. Now, it is your turn. Leave a comment sharing your worst HOA story and let us know if this tale gives you hope for standing up to petty authoritarians. Click that subscribe button if you enjoy seeing the underdog triumph over corrupt institutions, because we have more property rights disputes on the way. After all, American land is for American families, not corporate criminals. That concludes today's episode of HOA Madness. If witnessing justice prevail made your day, hit that like button, share your opinions below, and be sure to subscribe. More incredible neighborhood conflicts are on the horizon.